Holy cow. Everybody, are you there? Is anybody there? I'm so sorry. We are having first of the kind technical difficulties over here, and something of a shit show of a morning, I don't mind saying. I think we're all adults. So, hi everybody. I'm now talking to you through my phone, so I hope you can hear me all right. Sonia, jump in if that's not the case. So, all right. Let's jump in, guys. Welcome, everybody. New attendees. The way this goes is we run through some slides, get some basics down, and then we open it up for conversation, discussion. And this, as always, should be a very safe place to share and to keep privacy. So share as you like. There's no pressure to, but hopefully you'll feel welcome. And this should be a safe place among friendlies. Okay, so, all right. Questions on advanced care planning. And we say questions sort of on advanced care planning because the subject's huge and there's a lot to discuss and in many ways to skin this cat. So we're kind of going to go over basics. Sonia, over to you real quick about question asking.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for your patience. Two of the ways that you can interact here after BJ's kind of gone through the first slides and information, you can raise your hand up at the top and then we will unmute you and you can ask your question out loud, or you can type your question down below and we can read it out loud for you. So it's really up to you. If you're comfortable speaking out loud in the group, you can raise your hand, and if you'd prefer to just have it be read by us, or if you prefer to be anonymous, you can feel free to type the question in and we will read it out loud and get it answered. And if we do not have time to get to everyone's questions, please know that we will record a second session directly after to get to those. So if we don't get to it here, we will get to it later and we'll send out a link to those as well. Thanks again.
All right, thank you, Sonia. Okay, guys, so, okay. Advanced care planning, so some of you have heard, most of you probably have heard this phrase. Advanced care planning is sort of a semi-official, it's a process. And it's a process by which you state your wishes for your own care, for your own future care, generally speaking. And the advanced care planning is a way to kind of predict what's going to happen and to predict how you'd like to respond to it, and to set out a sort of an ethos and even more specific details of how you want to be cared for. All right, that's kind of a mouthful, but we'll open that up. So in some ways, advanced care planning is the stuff of documents, paperwork. That's how you kind of confirm your wishes. All right, so let's see here. So there's the advanced directive. All right, so the advanced directive is itself a form. It is a piece of paper. Every state has their own advanced directive, but they're all pretty much the same, and most of them cross state lines. If you were to Google your state advanced directive, you will get a form. But there are also private groups that will put a resource list out to you guys that have their own sort of versions of an advanced care directive that kind of walk you through it in a different way. Otherwise, it can look like a bunch of legalese and not a very helpful form. Some states require 2 witnesses who are not part of your care. Some require a notary, for example. But what we're going to speak to here is the sort of common denominator in terms of the content. So an advanced directive will cover things like organ donation, life support and resuscitation, artificial nutrition and hydration. Those are the sort of key elements of an advanced directive in terms of the details of care. And there are dementia-specific forms. Dementia is a particular disease or suite of diseases that, because this advanced directive is such a thinking document, there are dementia-specific documents that allow for you to kind of state your wishes in the context of dementia in advance of developing dementia. It starts to get real mind-bending, but just know that there are specific directives for folks who are living with dementia. All right, so the big ones here, of course, organ donation. The DMV asks you this too. There's much to say about the process of organ donation. I'll just leave it as it is for now. We can touch on it if it comes up in questions. Life support and resuscitation, of course, that's the stuff usually of ventilators, machines, generally invasive tools that help your body continue on. Breathing machine, feeding tubes, that's the second bucket here, but breathing machines, dialysis, these kinds of things, pacemakers, all sorts of coronary devices, LVADs that keep your body going. Almost entirely invasive, almost entirely not the stuff of nature, man-made stuff. And artificial nutrition is much the same way. For many reasons, we cannot either swallow or take in food, or we can't absorb food. And there are ways to put nutrition into the vein or into the stomach. Same with hydration. That last bullet here, I have to just dog ear for now. We should really talk about it. This gets very tricky in detail in real time. There's a lot to say about it, so let's be sure to circle back there. Probably the most important, so those are the mechanical bits of an advance directive, the things that you can prepare for and state your wishes around. As I was saying earlier, advance directives, this formal part of the advanced care planning, they are meant to help state your wishes. They force you to jump into the future in a state you might find yourself in, and then state your wishes as you feel about them now, how you'd want to be treated. So it's almost laughable. This is exercise of projecting yourself into the future, putting yourself in context into shoes that are very hard to imagine, and then asking you now to make decisions what you think you'd want then. So inherently clunky. Some of us feel very sure about those things. So some of us, an advanced directive is particularly powerful when you don't want to have anything to do with medical intervention. You're just not invasive, nothing, life support, etc., no matter what the circumstances. If you're on that side of the ledger, an advanced directive is pretty easy to fill out. You don't want any of those things. You want comfort care, right? On the other extreme, if you're the kind of person who wants everything done, no matter what, if it gives you another minute of life, and if life is measured in a pulse or a heartbeat, whatever, that's fine. You just want full court press. Similarly, those are easy to fill out. You want everything done, all those life support, etc. The tricky is most of us are somewhere in the middle. It's contextual. So depending on the situation, depending what my illness is or situation is, or what the potential for recovery is, or what my life is going to be like in these shoes, etc., that will color how we might decide to proceed or not with interventions. So those huge shades of gray are very, very difficult to document faithfully. You do your best on these forms, but all that is preamble to say what's most important, probably the sort of biggest takeaway of an advance directive, is really naming your healthcare proxy. That's a durable power of attorney for healthcare, or your agent. These are synonymous. These are synonyms. They all mean the same thing. And that proxy, it's a very important job. The proxy is an official person designated and protected by law, and they speak on your behalf. So it's a big responsibility. It's not projecting their own wishes for you. They have to represent your wishes faithfully and interface with the medical system, talk with the doctors, etc., about what to do and what not to do. So that's really, really key, because that person can move in real time with what's going on in the hospital and with your situation, and who will know you and know your life and what you can and can't deal with or don't want to deal with, etc. So that proxy is going to be a big job potentially if someone lands themselves in complicated medical shoes. There are a lot of decisions to make. So you generally want to pick someone who knows you very, very well, who's accessible, with whom you are up to date, because our minds change as we go through time, of course. We feel differently about life and what we're willing to live with. So they need to know you currently, actively. And ideally, you've had conversations about your health and about your wishes, about what you're willing to live with and not, etc. So you name this person and make sure you talk to them. Are they willing and able to take this job? They need to be reachable, for example. You can name generally three different proxies, or a team of proxies, a first, second, and third proxy, sort of a pecking order. You could also stipulate that those 2 or 3 people work as a team, but it's really best to have a single decision maker, ultimately the person with whom the buck stops. And here we are on the list here on the slide. That person has access to the medical records by law as your proxy, as your officially designated proxy, the right to consent or refuse treatment, diagnostic tests, etc. These are big, big decisions. I hope I'm not sounding scary. I mean, it's also an honored position. It's also one that feels very empowering as someone who loves the person in the bed. It can get tricky naming your proxy within family or friendship structures. Who gets to be the proxy? Who has to be the proxy? So there's a lot to say about this and a lot of stories around how this plays out. Another form that's really important for us to touch on here, guys, is the POLST. Different states have different names for this. Some states call it a MOLST. I can't remember the others. There are other names for this. And I think there are only 1 or 2 states that don't recognize this form yet. The POLST this is an acronym, Physician's Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment, all right? MOLST is Medical Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment. So now let me back up for a second. This is where all stuff gets tricky. So an advance directive, that piece of paper, is a legal document. It's not a medical document. It suggests to the doctors what your wishes would be. But the doctors and hospital systems can find ways to go around them or not honor them if there's any lack of clarity, or if they can't find the advance directive, or if you have 2 family members talking about the advance directive, contradicting each other. It can get really messy if it's not clear. Not everyone in your family and circle of friends is up to date on your advance directive. There's no medical punch to an advance directive. There is, however, to a POLST form, Physician's Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment. The POLST, unlike an advance directive, is signed by a physician. All right. So when you do your advance directive, you don't have to get a doctor's signature. You don't. There's nowhere for them to sign. You should make sure to give your doctor that advance directive so they have a copy and upload it into their system, et cetera, so that it's accessible. But there's no medical signature on it. This form, it's a 2-pager on 2 sides of 1 page, down and dirty advance directives, much the same content, but just really down to the basics, and it is signed by your physician, and therefore it has weight. So if someone presents a POLST to a paramedic or to a hospital, ER doctor, or wherever you might land yourself with a bunch of treatment on the line, there's a POLST. That is a pretty bulletproof legal document. The doctor really has to obey what you said on that POLST if it's filled out correctly and signed. Right? So it's a really, really important document for us to have, especially if we're in the advanced stages of illness. When landing in a hospital or death is likely, you want to make sure that this POLST, and if you're clear on your wishes, you want to make sure this POLST is accessible. A lot of people will put it with a fridge with a magnet under the refrigerator or whatever else. This is a key document, though, especially if you're sick. So DNR, let's just clarify a few terms real quick. You'll hear this phrase, or this acronym, DNR. That's Do Not Resuscitate. So that's one of the things that an advance directive or a POLST form will ask you about. Do you want to be resuscitated? In other words, when you die, if you're in the throes of active dying, do you want people to try to pull you back? It generally means electric shocks to the heart, often a breathing tube, etc. Do you want them to do everything they can to bring you out of the jaws of death back into life in some way, right? So it's a big question. Trick is, if we're living with the advanced stages of cancer, for example, advanced stages of heart disease, organ failure, etc., yeah, chances of resuscitation are very, very small. Even if you can get a heart rate back, you're not likely to leave the institution if you're in a hospital, for example. So in contrast to Hollywood, where chest compression and the person gets back to life and stands up and goes on about their business, it doesn't happen that way. Rarely does resuscitation work, especially in advanced stages of illness. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And it really only kicks in when you die. It's a question of when you die, do we want to try to bring you back? So the other acronym for this, and some hospitals are taking on to put it in a more positive frame, is AND, Allow Natural Death. Do Not Resuscitate, which sounds a little foreboding and negatively framed. But rather in this way, we're allowing nature to take its course. It means the same thing, just a different flavor. And more institutions are using that language. But DNR is still the standard. Each of those is in contrast to full code. So full code, these are your code status, right? So full code that means you want everything done. And if you have not stated that's the default. So if you have not made a DNR wish known, the default will be full code. paramedics, EMR guys, everybody, EMS guys, everyone, doctors, ER, everyone, they will be sort of duty bound in general, unless death is very obvious. They will be duty bound to try to resuscitate you. That is a full code, unless you say otherwise. Okay, so advanced care planning, it gets tricky. There are other elements too about sort of how you want to be handled, how you want to be treated, where you want to spend your time. There are other details that can go in an advanced care plan. But all of these things, the medical details, the social details, you can see how advanced care planning is really a conversation. It needs to be talked through with people close in. It is not just a form. It is not just a checkbox. It's not just a transitional moment. It's really, if you want this to go the way it comports with you as a person, it really requires a lot of dynamic conversation. It's about a relationship with your family, your friends, with your doctor. It's a conversation to have again and again. It's not a one-time thing. So a lot of us will do an advanced directive, then once a year pull it out and review it with our family. It still makes sense to us. We change our mind, great. You can fix it then or keep on chugging. Bottom line here, conceive of advanced care planning as a conversation, as a relationship, a relational dynamic, all right? That's where this all plays out, okay? And that's why the proxy is so important, the relationship with the doctor, the relationship with you. They're a bridge they can navigate for you, all right? Oops. Okay, guys, thanks for bearing with me. Whirlwind kind of tour over advanced care planning and advanced care directive details. Let's take what time we have left to get to questions and talk this out, because again, this can sound pretty dang abstract and maybe not even helpful without some situations to talk through.
BJ, before we go to questions, we've had a few things come into the question chat area that I just want to bring up as more of a discussion than a direct question. Someone brought up organ donation and the important distinction of the fact that you need to be in a hospital to have your organs donated. So that's an important consideration. So if you die at home, you're not going to be able to donate your organs. I think your skin and eyeballs are an option, but if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yep. Yeah, it's an important point. Organ donation for most of us seems like just a beautiful idea. Really a way for us to, if our death can then help someone else live, amazing, really. It can be a very meaningful designation. So what doesn't often get discussed in the DMV or wherever else you might check the box for organ donation is that the fact that, as Sonia just mentioned, the solid organs they can't be lifeless really at all to be useful again. The second life goes out of an organ, generally speaking, that's pretty much it. So for organ donation to actually work, you, the dying person, need to be in a hospital where someone is watching, or is a team of people watching your life wind down and are at the ready to harvest your organs at the right time. All right, so that's a lot to coordinate. That generally just can't happen outside of a hospital, but for all practical purposes. So as you imagine donation, and as you imagine advanced care for yourself, if organ donation is very important for you, well then, and you're at the tail end of life with advanced illness, talking with your doctors about maybe trying to actually pass away in the hospital would be important to you. Most of the time, we're talking about people getting out of the hospital and dying at home. We always presume that's where most people want to be. But if organ donation is really important to you, then you kind of have to upend that. So that's the deal with solid organ donations, donating your heart, your liver, your kidneys, etc. The exceptions are your corneas. They are relatively avascular, meaning there's not a big need for blood supply. And they can do their thing as a structure harvested from a body who's already deceased, and that's just really about it. There may be some other details there, but really picture your organ, your corneas as the one thing that you can donate from afar in a way. Now, lastly, the last little detail is what's often called a willed body program. So some folks. I've had a lot of patients who are very grateful to medical research, want to participate in medical research, or have had a complex illness that didn't go by the books or whatever else, and doctors, researchers, and a patient want to know Well, so at the time of death, one can will their body to a research institution for them to run experiments with. Sometimes they could you can become the cadaver in an anatomy lab, for example. So if that's of interest to you, it's a separate pathway from organ donation per se. And that's something you usually have to set up with the research institution in advance. So for my patients at UCSF, for example, and they've gotten all their care at UCSF and they know they're dying soon, well, they can call the pathology department and in advance say, hey, when I die, I'd like to donate my body to research purposes. And they'll take you down a pathway. All right, so those are your options of what can be done with your remains, your bodily remains. Sonia, back to you. Were there other?
Yeah. What happens when someone doesn't have an advance directive? So a lot of times I think there's conflict around choices for people's care. So if there isn't one and there's one family member who comes in and says, we're going to do this, and another family member comes in and says, nope, we're going to do this. So how the advance directive can help mitigate that type of conflict.
Yeah, that's probably one of its most important uses. Very often, it's interesting, like in my clinical practice, when I was more clinically active, oftentimes our patients, we as a palliative care team, their oncologists, we knew them so well, over time, in so many ways, we didn't need the paperwork to tell us what that person wanted, and oftentimes it was just clear enough. Family was involved, there was a lot of engagement. But that's pretty unusual for a person that in general, you can't count on that sort of consistent care over time with the same practitioners, et cetera. So this is where the advance directive really is, you kind of have to see it as a defensive document on some level. So sort of defending against worst case scenarios. And one of those worst case scenarios is when you have family members, oftentimes with no malice, they just disagree with how they interpreted something that you may have said to them, or maybe you as a patient were in a different mood when you talk to one family member or the other, or the family members may be so emotionally just freaked out and bereft of what's going on that they are struggling to discern their own feelings about what they want for you versus what you might want for you. So suffice it to say, even with best intentions within family groups, differences of opinion can crop up all the time, different wishes, and people can swear they heard a patient say that they wanted full code, and then the other sibling or other can swear they heard the patient say there's no way in hell they'd want to live on a machine. So that happens a lot, and again, it's not necessarily malicious, but it gets very confusing, and you can imagine how in the throes of care and making decisions, it can lead to gridlock. And then you sort of end up with a default mode, and the default mode is do everything, do more, ICU, more tubes, more whatever. So it quickly gets messy. So this is exactly why stating your wishes on an advance directive can clarify or can cut through all of that chatter, and naming an official proxy who makes the decision no matter what chatter is going on in the family. All those things can be so critical when there are differences of opinion or differences of view. Okay, so that's really the reason to have an advance directive, probably the major reason. And in this way, too, guys, I want to sort of make the point here that oftentimes people don't find a way to do an advance directive. They're too clunky. They don't want to think about their death. They put it off. It's just whatever. We all, like 80% of us agree that they're important documents, and something like 20% of us have done them. But if you conceive of this as, yes, sure, to protect your own wishes at the end of life, which is plenty reason, of course, some of us can't be quite moved enough to do something just for ourselves that way. But, you can get a lot farther to say, hey, mom, hey, dad, whatever. Please do your advance directive. You're doing me a big favor. And I, as a physician, have said that to so many people. I hear you don't care about whatever happens at the end of your life, but your kids are going to care. And you're going to save them a lot of heartache if you state your wishes so they don't have to agonize in their own grief about what you do or do not want, etc. So in other words, yes, this is back to this advance directive and advance care planning as a relational process, and the advance care directive as a loving document. because you can help your family avoid all sorts of extra heartache by making your wishes known up front. Then the family are left to grieve, to be sad, and all those other things, but they're not at each other's throats, and they're not necessarily feeling like it pressures on them to get the right answer. Like, what do I do? Do I pull a plug? Do I not pull a plug? You can imagine that's a huge, huge burden. Very, very difficult to navigate. But if I know what mom or dad wants, and it says it right there on paper, boy, does that take me out of the middle. So think of an advanced care directive. An advanced directive is a loving document, as a way to protect your family, not just your own wishes. Okay, well, I went on for a while there. Sonia, was there another?
There's one other point that I was hoping we could just talk about quickly, and that is care and handling instructions. It's just a lovely concept that we had talked about that I think would be nice to share.
Yeah, care and handling instructions. So that's language we use, that Shoshana and Sonia and I in our book, A Beginner's Guide to the End. So advanced care planning is sort of this generalized, big, informal sort of how to think about the care you want in advance of it. Because once that momentum gets going, it's hard to think straight. So just thinking about what you want for your future care, right? And we've talked so much about that, the medical piece of that, the advanced directive, those big time medical questions, right? Those are huge and really, really important. But as we all know, experience of life, the experience of death is in details. Small things really matter, right? So care and handling instructions is just our phrase. It's sort of informal, like you can add on to your advanced directive on a separate piece of paper, or staple it to your advanced directive, or just make sure your family has access to this one way or another. These kinds of details are like, hey, are you a side sleeper? Do you want, when you're not able to say for yourself, do you want the nurse and anybody else to put you on your side? Do you like a pillow between your knees? Do you love the smell of coffee in the morning? What kind of music do you want in the background, if any? Is it really, really important for you to be in some room or in a home or wherever? These kinds of things, which aren't of medical significance per se, where it gets so much the attention, but in terms of the experience for you and your family, this can make it a much more personal and tender and specific process. So feel free, if you feel strongly about these things, to note those in your advanced directive. You're doing your family a huge service. They'll feel so good knowing they're doing what you want them to do when they're spinning and bereft, right? So those are care and handling instructions. That's a really lovely level of detail that you won't find on the standard advanced care directive form, but you can add it, all right?
Okay, thanks for all that. We can head into these questions now. And the first one, let's see here. Can you discuss the difference between a state advanced directive form and a POLST form? Also, my understanding is that a POLST is only valid for a year and you must have a terminal illness versus an advanced directive. Is that true? So kind of two questions. So the validity of a POLST for how long? And if you need to have a terminal illness for one.
We'll get back to you. I haven't looked at a POLST form in a little while. I do not think there's an expiration date on a POLST form. I'm quite certain of that. We'll double check.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. I believe that they are valid ongoing, so that's why it's important to revisit them. Yeah,
exactly. They're good until you say they're not. Oh, and by the way, a little detail on POLST forms, advanced directives, all of this stuff. They only kick in when you can't say for yourself in that moment. So don't feel like you're afraid to put your wishes on paper because then you're stuck with them. No, you as long as you're thinking clearly and can communicate, you always run the show in terms of your medical decisions. Believe it or not, you always get to say what you want. So the advanced directive and POLST forms only kick in when you are not in a position to speak. You can't speak. You're unconscious, you're delirious, whatever it is. So as long as you're in compos mentis, thinking clearly and can communicate your wishes, you're always in charge. Again, these documents only kick in when you can't speak for yourself. Okay? I should make that really, really clear. Now, back to the question here. So no, POLST Form, we're pretty darn sure does not have an expiration date. It's good until you say otherwise, or until you rip it up and write a new one. But anytime you make a change to your POLST or advanced directive, make sure you let everybody in your circle know, including your doctor. Otherwise, it's just a secret that otherwise will confuse people. So changes to your POLST or advanced directive, always welcome. You can change it 20 times in a year. Just make sure to update everybody in your circle and throw away the old one so there's no confusion. Did that answer the question, Sonia, or was there more to it?
I think there's a little bit. So just who should have a POLST? If it's for terminal illnesses only, who should have one?
It's not. A POLST is, anyone can have a POLST. Your doctor would probably look at you a little funny if you brought a POLST form in for him or her to sign, and you're 25 years old and have no health issues. Because how can you possibly feel so strongly about your wishes at a young age when you haven't really danced with illness, etc. So, but there'd be nothing illegal. The doctor might not sign it, but you can certainly ask. So the POLST is really, it's not reserved for people who have terminal or advanced illness, but that's where it's really most useful. When death is expected in the near term, months, weeks, days, that's when a POLST is particularly important, because death is coming, because falling down at home is very likely, and paramedics arriving and wondering what to do, whether to resuscitate you, etc., all that stuff. When it's much more likely to happen and you feel very clear on your wishes, that's when a POLST is most poignant and most powerful. But there's nothing legally protecting it around. You don't have to have a terminal illness to have a POLST. Anyone can have a POLST.
Okay, we had a quick a question about these documents that I just want to read out and answer really quickly. The person says, do these documents need to be notarized or prepared by a lawyer? So for advanced directive, you will most likely need to have it be notarized unless you have the two witnesses. And then for the POLST and the DNR, those need to be signed by your physician. So those are the types of signatures you would need for both. Okay, so the next one is, can you get into conflict with a doctor's order versus an advanced directive? For example, doctor's order may be on file, but advanced directive could be more recent.
Say that last, for example, a doctor's order.
A doctor's order may be on file, I'm guessing in the patient's chart, but an advanced directive could be more recent. So maybe the advanced directive is in the home. So right, in that case, let's remember that advanced directive is a legal document, not a medical one, and no doctor has signed it. So a doctor or an institution, if you say, let's say they have on file a doctor's signature around a DNR order or some previous advanced directive, and that's been in the computer and acknowledged, in the health system and acknowledged, and doctors have noted it. If you then present in the ER and some bad things are going on and family brings an advanced directive that has a later date, a more recent advanced directive. So this is where it gets tricky. Legally, the doctor can, if they wanted to, can say, well, no, the last order I have said this, and so I'm going with this. Because an advanced directive isn't a medically binding document. It's stating your wishes, but there's not a lot of teeth to it. Doctor really doesn't have to follow it. And by the way, legal reform around this is an active issue, because in the past, when I was trained, for example, we were always pushed to, when there's any doubt what the patient or family wants, default to doing everything full code. Because if you don't, well, gosh, and if you don't try to resuscitate the person or whatever else, of course the family's going to sue you. So default to trying to resuscitate someone unless it's very clear that they don't want that. It used to do sort of a cover your tail kind of presentation when I was trained, like to avoid lawsuits, resuscitate people. Now, increasingly, I'm hoping we're going to find folks who are suing health systems for resuscitating a person who did not want to be resuscitated. That's happening. I expect that to happen more. So this is where it gets so tricky, where you so want a POLST, where you want that doctor's order. So if you show up in an ER with a POLST,
that is signed by the doctor and is dated more recently than the old computer order in that health system, legally that POLST should supersede. So that's the difference of a good example where the teeth of a POLST are much more impressive and relevant in the medical system than an advance directive.
Okay, great. We do have one hand up. Douglas, I'm going to unmute you, and then you will need to unmute yourself. So I might just take a quick second. Douglas, can you hear us? Hey, Douglas, it looks like you're unmuted if you want to ask your question. Okay, I'll go ahead and mute you, and we can go back to some other questions and try in a second.
While you're doing that, I just want to clarify one thing, guys. I think I forgot to mention. So advanced care planning kind of dovetails nicely with estate planning, and if you're talking to your lawyer about getting your affairs in order, estate plans, financial issues, avoiding probate, all those things that affect the non-medical decisions are often part of the advanced care planning process to some degree, or estate planning process. So just to note that. Also, the language here. So a living will and an advance directive are essentially synonymous. So sometimes you'll hear people refer to a living will or an advance directive. Consider them synonymous.
Okay, we've got a few more questions to get here. Are there any repercussions for the medical team when they do not abide by documented advance directives or talk the healthcare proxy out of any decisions that you have made?
So legally, these are big judgment calls here. And like I was saying a minute ago, I expect there would be more and more, as more of us are aging and living with chronic illness, and there's going to be sort of more and more of us dying in complex ways, more and more of us dying with advanced directives on board, because we will have had long bouts of chronic illness and pretty clear about our wishes, and hopefully we'll document them, etc. So I expect, and that's at odds with a health system that still has a palpable legacy of paternalism and sort of making decisions on your behalf, or based on what they think is right. We know that still happens. This is where the advance directive or living will, I mentioned a moment ago, is a defensive document. The medical system will keep on churning, generally speaking, as a rule. There's tons of momentum. There's not a lot of time to think. They've got a lot of experience often. So for one way or another, you're freaked out. For all sorts of reasons, the medical system has a ton of momentum, and it's hard to upend it. And it will default to do more, to try other things, try new drugs, try new interventions, et cetera, et cetera. So the advance directive is a way to actually insert yourself and say, at some point really to say no. It's in this way, it's something of a defensive document. So, we're in this tricky. So the answer to this question is you probably have to find out in court. This will be a judgment call. You'd probably go through ombudsman at the hospital if there's a dispute and try to work it out that way, et cetera. But eventually, a lot of these situations are going to probably have to end up in some sort of legal battle of some kind, legal discussion. Because again, an advance directive without a POLST is really a suggestion. The doctor is going to have ethically going to have to have really good reason why they ignored an advance directive and shot past it and did what they thought was best. I have heard that happening, particularly in some hospitals with a religious affiliation, depending on the wishes stated, et cetera. So it does happen, and it's really, really tricky. But this is where protect yourself with a POLST, and also pay attention, and not only do your advance directive, but make sure to talk to your doctor about this, right? And if your primary care doctor or your oncologist, whoever is most involved in your care, and if you've really talked this out and gone through this directive and it's uploaded into their system, you're pretty well protected. It's not bulletproof. A POLST form would make it much more bulletproof, but I bet you people find a way around that, or they can't find the document in real time, or one thing leads to another, who knows what. most of those times the death was coming one way or another. The family are bereft or overwhelmed. The doctor may have tried very hard, even if to go against the person's wishes, but thought they were doing the right thing. One way or another, there's a lot of people who have no taste to take this to court, or have no energy to push the sort of legal things, and these things kind of fade away. But so for the advocate and activists and all of us, this is where not only do your advance directive, but communicate it. Make sure everyone knows it. Make it as hard as possible for anyone to supersede it or go around it, and shore it up with a POLST. But legally, you're not clearly protected by an advance directive by itself. That's pretty murky. They're pretty easy to undermine. Find a family member who thought they heard otherwise. Find a doctor who said they couldn't find it. Whatever else, it's pretty easy to slip around or slip through.
We've got another hand raised here. Sylvia, I'm going to unmute you, see if we can get to you before the end.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for this. This is so helpful and clear. I recently heard a panel of Johns Hopkins ER doctors talking about advanced healthcare and POLST and do not resuscitate. And basically their consensus was that CPR doesn't work 97% of the time. And many of them actually wore medallions or had tattooed DNR because of the A, most of the time CPR doesn't work, and B, when it does, it often leaves the patient in a vegetative state and really is not a good situation, unlike all the TV shows. So for relatively healthy people, let's say you're out very active and, backpacking and climbing or, whatever, and there can be accidents. What would you recommend having a medallion that says do not resuscitate? Because if you go too long without oxygen, you're going to be a wreck.
Ooh, it's tricky, Sylvia. There's so many variables in this mix, right? I mean, so first your point is, I think we mentioned earlier, you're right, resuscitation rarely works. It's not, it rarely works, and sometimes it sort of partially works. In other words, restores a pulse, but to your point, the person is left in a vegetative state. And for a lot of folks, that's not good enough. They would not consider life. And then it kicks it off to the family to someday decide whether to pull the plug. A brutal process, can be a brutal process for family. So tricky. But the bottom line is that the hard part, of course, sometimes resuscitation does work. And to your example of someone being young and healthy and out hiking, if they get in an accident or something befalls them, a full court press doing every medical intervention might make good sense for that person. It might very well be a good chance of recovery, and you're certainly not going to know until you try. This is where it's just so dang difficult. So I wouldn't say that resuscitation is so often a failure that it's never worth trying. I've been involved in resuscitations that have brought someone back, and they do leave the hospital and go on about their lives. That's not that rare. That happens. So it's not. This is where it gets so tricky. So you're back to stating your wishes and staying up to date with your family and friends of what you'd be willing to live with. That I think is the best way to go, because if you try to project yourself into a future situation, there are too many scenarios with too many variables to imagine. But if you got a really good buddy or a partner who knows you really well and in real time can talk with the doctors and say, he or she cares about this or that, I know if these are the odds he wouldn't want to do it or would, to make these real-time judgment calls. That's why the proxy is so important. It's just too hard. You can't account for all the zillions of variables that affect the outcome in advance. So Sylvia, does that answer your point?
Yes, it definitely does. And I have one more, thank you, one more little corollary to that. So given that CPR would be initiated because you're not breathing, because your heart is stopped, what would be the length of time between the cessation of breathing and discernible heartbeat and irrevocable brain damage? what would be that timing?
So a lot of variables here too. Depends on the substrate, depends on the body involved. So, if that body involved is very old or very infirm, or has a ton of atherosclerosis, or their brains have atrophied, or, there's so many variables in there. But that would affect the sort of time to devastating results. Anoxia is what we call this. So if you're not breathing, you're not getting any oxygen, anoxia. So you can be anoxic for not very, so if you're already in a fragile state, you can't tolerate anoxia for very long. If you're young and healthy and have a vibrant cardiovascular system and neurological system, then you can put up with a little more time of anoxia. If you are in cold water, for example, if you're in cold weather, hypothermia can actually extend the length that you can be anoxic and come back to a full life, a full bodily physiological life. So a lot of variables, but I would say in general, I wouldn't say, more than a couple minutes and you're pretty quickly in trouble, if that gets us in the ballpark. But I also remember, Sylvia, you asked about a DNR medallion. If you feel really strongly, no matter how healthy you are, you can get a DNR, an out-of-hospital DNR, that will be signed by the physician. You should get your physician signed. Then you can get a medallion or a bracelet. And those, the person can find them and respond to them. Those can work. There's some legal teeth there. Tattoos, that's come up. There have been places, that's not clear. Did the person, there's one guy, there's a story in our book about a guy who got DNR tattoo. It had something to do with when he lost a bet. So it's not, a tattoo is not a legally binding document, but it has been upheld as a piece of evidence, as a part of the picture for someone who had a DNR tattoo and conversations with family members about what they did, what they wanted for their advance directive, etc. So in conjunction with other conversations and consistencies with the family, a tattoo can certainly be a helpful point in the right direction, but there's nothing legally binding about it. Sylvia, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much. This is just wonderful, and thank you for everything you're doing.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Thank you. I mean, these things only really work in conversation. Otherwise, I'd just be talking to this piece of plastic. So thank you.
All right, we're a little past 11 here. Sorry, BJ, to cut you off there. I just want to be respectful of people's time.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone again for rolling with us in the late start. We do have quite a few questions that we were not able to get to, but please don't worry, I've noted all of them, and BJ and I will answer them in a second recording here, and we will send you the link to those tomorrow. So if you wrote a question in and we didn't get to it, please know we'll answer it separately.
Yeah, and thanks again, everybody, for your patience this morning. That was, we're very sorry about the technical problems. Thanks for hanging in there. And here's our prompt here, guys. So much of all this technical stating your wishes, blah, 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 really gets back to this relationship, right? What do you want your doctor to know about you? You, specifically you, your wishes, your dreams, your hopes, what you live for, what you don't want to live for, all this stuff. What do you want your doctor to know about you? So let's just say you don't have an advance directive, but your doctor knows you pretty well. Boy, that person can advocate for you if he or she knows you very well. So the prompt here is, what do you want your doctor to know about you? Okay, guys. Again, thanks so much. We'll be in touch with more resources and some more questions answered. All right. Take care till next time. Bye-bye.